From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Millions of Floridians are being impacted by this storm. This is a serious threat of serious threat of significant storm surge flooding along the entire west coast of Florida. And this has increased to 15 feet of impact above ground level in southwest Florida.
Hurricane Irma slams into Florida, becoming the second Category 4 hurricane to hit the United States in less than a month. We'll look at how climate change is fueling more powerful storms and is also driving the mass extinction of parasites that are critical to natural ecosystems and could add to the planet's sixth mass extinction. We'll speak with the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Elizabeth Kolbert and scientist Colin Carlson. Then we look at Hurricane Irma's impact on Haiti and the Caribbean.
Hurricane Irma is the strongest and largest storm ever that has come out of the Atlantic. It caused devastation throughout the Caribbean. It's the size of Texas, and Haiti, even though it didn't get a direct hit, was severely damaged by this.
And we'll hear voices of the earthquake in Mexico, the survivors. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 4 people have died and nearly 6 million people are without power in Florida after Hurricane Irma made landfall Sunday on the Florida Keys as a Category 4 hurricane. The storm also flooded the streets of downtown Miami, turning the city's main strip, Brickell Avenue, into a 3-foot-high raging river. Its arrival sparked one of the largest mass evacuations in U.S. history, with nearly 7 million people ordered to leave their homes. Before hitting Florida, Irma caused widespread devastation across the Caribbean, killing at least 27 people and leveling nearly 90% of all structures in St. Martin and Barbuda. It also displaced more than 100,000 Haitians and destroyed crops in the north of Haiti. Cuba has dispatched more than 750 health workers to Caribbean nations to help assist in the aftermath of the most powerful storm ever recorded over the Atlantic Ocean. Irma, now downgraded to a Category 1 storm, is still barreling across more of Florida and then on to Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. We'll have more on Irma and climate change after headlines. Meanwhile, President Trump is using Hurricane Irma as an excuse to push for tax cuts for the rich. This is Trump speaking Saturday.
To create prosperity at home, we'll be discussing our plan for dramatic tax cuts and tax reform. And I think now with what's happened with the hurricane, I'm going to ask for a speed up.
Best-selling author Naomi Klein tweeted, "More one for the shock doctrine record books. Trump uses Irma to push for tax cuts while the storm is still happening." In Mexico, the death toll from Thursday's devastating 8.2 magnitude earthquake has risen to 90 people as rescue teams continue to search through the rubble in parts of the southern states of Oaxaca and Chiapas. This is survivor Oscar Morga in Oaxaca.
Prácticamente quedamos sin nada.
We are practically left with nothing.
Did you lose everything?
Everything. Absolutely everything. Everything. So a friend came to help me because authorities aren't helping us. They just go by and pass us by. They're not helping us.
We'll have more voices from the survivors of Mexico's earthquake later in the broadcast. Meanwhile, in Italy, unexpected flooding in the western port city of Livorno has killed at least 6 people. This is Livorno resident Piero Carturelli.
In all my years, I don't remember a storm anything like this that has caused all this damage. It's incredible, incredible. It started around 10 p.m. and continued until this morning. In my living memory, there's never been anything like this.
The U.S. State Department has approved a nearly $4 billion weapons deal with Bahrain. The $3.8 billion deal includes 19 Lockheed Martin F-16 fighter jets and over 200 Raytheon anti-tank missiles. The approval of the weapons deal came after Secretary of State Rex Tillerson dropped human rights issues as a condition of the sale. Bahrain is the closest U.S. ally home to the Navy's Fifth Fleet. In Syria, the local journalistic group Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, reports the U.S.-led coalition fired white phosphorus into Raqqa Friday. White phosphorus munitions can burn human flesh down to the bone, and wounds contaminated by the chemical can reignite up to days later, poisoning victims and leading to organ failure or death. The group also reports U.S.-led coalition warplanes have bombed at least 25 mosques since the battle to seize Raqqa from ISIS began in June. Meanwhile, in more news on Syria, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says Russian airstrikes near the city of Deir ez-Zor killed at least 34 civilians, including 9 children, on Sunday. Kenya is preparing to hold a rerun of its contested presidential election next month after the first election was nullified by Kenya's Supreme Court. The court ruled there were flaws in the tallying process for the August 8th election. At least 24 people were killed in post-election protests. The incumbent president, Uhuru Kenyatta, will now face opposition leader Raila Odinga again in a new election on October 17th. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, says the Burmese military's widespread violence against Rohingya Muslims is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Nearly 300,000 Rohingyas have fled to neighboring Bangladesh since last month as Burmese soldiers have killed and raped civilians and burned down villages. The Burmese government rejected a ceasefire proposed by the Rohingya militant group on Sunday. In the Gaza Strip, health officials say they're witnessing a sharp rise in suicide attempts as the ongoing Israeli blockade has made the Palestinian territory unlivable, according to the United Nations. Among those who have taken their own lives is 22-year-old short story writer Mohamed Yunus, who committed suicide 2 weeks ago. This summer, Israeli-imposed electricity cuts left Gaza residents with power for only 4 hours a day. This is Red Cross President Peter Moror.
Let's just for a minute imagine how life is with 4 hours of electricity, with wastewater pump not functioning, with running water not functioning, and I think this is the reality at the present moment.
Peter Moror is the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. In Kashmir, hundreds of people protested against Indian rule and violence by security forces after Indian government forces shot dead 2 people today and another 2 Sunday. Indian authorities say all 4 were armed rebels. Indian government forces have killed over 140 suspected rebels and deployed thousands of additional soldiers to the occupied territory of Kashmir so far this year amidst an offensive dubbed Operation All Out. In London, organizers say as many as 50,000 people marched Saturday to oppose Brexit, Britain's plan to leave the European Union. Today in the British Parliament, some Labour Party lawmakers are planning to vote against legislation outlining plans for Brexit, known as the European Union Withdrawal Bill. Australia held the largest demonstration for LGBT rights in the country's history Sunday. More than 20,000 people poured into the streets of Sydney to demand equal rights regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. This is Australian activist Joy Kiriakou.
I think it's amazing. They said before this is the largest LGBTIQ rights rally ever in Australian history, and that's pretty incredible. So very proud to be here, and I'm here with all of my family and with my wife. So we're really happy to be here too.
Back in the United States, in San Francisco, residents gathered for a candlelight vigil to mourn the murder of transgender activist, artist, and DJ Bubbles Torres, who was shot and killed early Sunday. Bubbles was a beloved member of the LGBT community who'd lived in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood for nearly 2 decades. Prisoner advocates say former Black Panther Herman Bell was attacked by half-dozen prison guards at the Great Meadow Correction Facility in New York State last week. The guards reportedly broke 2 of his ribs, bloodied his face, and damaged his left eye by spraying mace directly into his eyes. 69-year-old Herman Bell has been imprisoned for more than 40 years. And Saturday marked the first anniversary of the largest prison work strike in U.S. history. On September 9, 2016, prisoners launched a nationwide work strike that spread across 29 prisons to include more than 24,000 prisoners. Last year's strike, launched on the anniversary of the 1971 Attica prison uprising, sparked widespread retaliation by prison guards, including in Michigan's Kinross Correctional Facility. This is prisoner, poet, and abolitionist Fred Williams speaking about the strike and the retaliation in an interview just recently released by Rust Belt Abolition Radio.
They decided that they were going to stand out and protest protest the food, protest health service, protest the ventilation, protest the living conditions overall. And so as these few guys stood outside, walking in circles, protesting, chanting, equal work, equal pay, chanting, and they were also calling for other guys inside the housing units to come out and stand with them in solidarity. And it worked. And they walked in circles in the common area chanting, and the crowd just grew larger and larger and larger, and to the point where when I looked out the window, it looked like it was maybe 500-600 guys out there. And so the ERT was called in, the emergency response team was called in. It took 4 or 5 hours, and from what I understand, it's either the first or second time the government allowed for live ammunition to be entered onto the prison compound in Michigan.
That was prisoner Fred Williams at Michigan's Kinross Correctional Facility in an audio archive just released because some prisoners were isolated in solitary confinement as retaliation for the strike for nearly a year. And today is the 16th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the United States continues to deal with unprecedented floods and hurricanes, a new study has revealed climate change is also driving the mass extinction of parasites that are critical to natural ecosystems and could add to the planet's 6th great mass extinction event that's currently underway. The report in the journal Science Advances warns about a third of all parasite species could go extinct by 2070 due to human activity. The loss of species of lice, fleas, and worms could have profound ripple effects on the environment and might pave the way for new parasites to colonize humans and other animals with disastrous health outcomes. This comes as scientists are warning that the Earth's 6th mass extinction is already underway. In a study published last month in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the researchers said billions of populations of animals have disappeared from the Earth amidst what they called a biological annihilation. They said the findings were worse than previously thought. Scientists say the main causes of the mass extinction of wildlife is human overpopulation and overconsumption, especially by the rich, the destruction of animals' habitats, toxic pollution, and climate change. The report also warns humans will be impacted by this mass extinction, writing, quote, "The resulting biological annihilation obviously will have serious ecological, economic, and social consequences. Humanity will eventually pay a very high price for the decimation of the only assemblage of life that we know of in the universe," unquote. We're joined now by two guests. Colin Carlson, lead author of the Parasite Extinction Report published last week, Ph.D. candidate in environmental science, policy, and management, University of California, Berkeley. And joining us via Democracy Now! Video stream from Western Massachusetts, we're joined by Elizabeth Colbert, award-winning journalist and staff writer at The New Yorker magazine, where she's reported extensively on climate change. Her most recent piece is headlined Hurricane Harvey and the Storms to Come. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her 2015 book, The 6th Extinction. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Elizabeth Colbert, let's begin with you. As you see the coverage of what's taken place in Texas with Hurricane Harvey, and now as Hurricane Irma has barreled through the Caribbean, making landfall in Florida this weekend and heading its way up, can you talk about the connection between climate change and hurricanes?
Well, there are a few things that are pretty clear. One is simply that sea levels are rising, and sea level rise is actually accelerating, owing in large part to ice melt, accelerating ice melt off of Greenland, actually. So we know that pretty clearly. And if you have higher sea levels, obviously when you get a storm surge, it's going to go, higher and further inland. So that's a very, basic connection between hurricanes and sea level rise. Then we also know that hurricanes draw their power. How they get their energy is from the surface waters of the ocean. So that's why we only get hurricanes in the summertime, right? Because they need warm water. And as water temperatures rise, theory suggests and models suggest that hurricane strength is going to rise. So you're getting this kind of weird argument about hurricane frequency. That's not clear what's going to happen to hurricane frequency as water temperatures rise, but hurricane strength should rise, and we probably are already seeing that. And the third thing we know is that warmer air holds more moisture We're getting more evaporation. And as you get more evaporation, you're going to get more rain. And that's pretty clear that we're also seeing that, too, not necessarily in hurricanes, but just in rainfall in general. We're getting more of these very massive downpours, and that's quite well documented.
So can you talk about there's two things going on. You have the President of the United States in Texas. You have the leadership, the Republican leadership there, all well-known climate change deniers. But then you also have the media, which it's out of Fox, MSNBC, CNN, have been fiercely critical of President Trump. But when it comes to coverage of these hurricanes, and it's almost wall-to-wall coverage, explaining everything scientifically, how the surges happen, except using the words climate change or global warming or climate chaos. Can you talk about the lack of discussion of climate change in this wall-to-wall coverage of these severe, more frequent hurricanes that we're seeing?
Well, I think that there is a couple things going on, and some of them are legitimate. I don't, want to criticize all my colleagues in the news media who are trying to do a very difficult job under difficult circumstances of standing outside in a hurricane. But, any individual hurricane, so you always get this conversation, any individual hurricane and the behavior of any individual hurricane, there are so many random, factors in the weather system. So that is not an event that can be directly traced to climate change. And so you get this constant, can we actually attribute this to climate change? And the answer is no. We can't attribute Harvey to climate change. We can't attribute Irma to climate change. We can't attribute even their strength to climate change. We can only say, that these are the kinds of events that have been predicted by the models of climate change. And over time, you get these big data sets and you can say more and more. So I think that people are in a complicated situation right now while a hurricane is going on. Then there's also, and this is a political, people accusing journalists of politicizing a hurricane. And other people point out, look, we're by pointing out the connection between fierce storms and climate change, we are not politicizing a hurricane. It's actually the reverse. People who are refusing, to point that out are politicizing the science. The science is very clear on this.
On Thursday, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt appeared on CNN. He said, quote, here's the issue. To have any kind of focus on the cause and effect of the storm versus helping people or actually facing the effect of the storm is misplaced. He went on to say, quote, what we need to focus on is access to clean water, addressing these areas of Superfund activities that may cause an attack on water, these issues of access to fuel. Those are things so important to citizens of Florida right now. And to discuss the cause and effect of these storms, there's the place and time to do that. It's not now. Elizabeth Kolbert.
Yeah, that's always what you get, and someone, someone put out I thought a very clever tweet about how it's never the right time during the storm. Before the storm, it's not the right time to talk about climate change. During the right time, storm is not the right time, according to Scott Pruitt and his ilk, to talk about climate change. After the storm, when you're in recovery, it's not the right time to talk about storms and climate change. And then when there's no storms, where are the storms? What happened to your climate change? So there's never the right time to talk about climate change for people like Scott Pruitt, and that's clearly very well thought out. That's not that's always the tactic, and we as a public really need to demand that people like Scott Pruitt talk about climate change. And the fact that Scott Pruitt runs the EPA, someone who is denying and denouncing basic science in this country, is very scary and should be very scary to people.
Reading from your piece in The New Yorker, Coming Storms, you write, as rainfall totals in Houston were topping 40 inches, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson told Congress he was planning to eliminate his department's special envoy for climate change. You go on to say Lamar Smith, a Republican who represents parts of San Antonio, chairs the House Committee on Science, Space and Technology. Smith has spent the better part of his career harassing climate scientists. In a recent op-ed for the Daily Signal, a website sponsored by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, he celebrated the effects of global warming, arguing they were producing beneficial changes to the Earth's geography. And you go on to talk about at a town hall meeting in April, Joe Barton, a Republican who represents parts of Fort Worth, chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, repeated the old denier canard, clouds are the cause of climate change. And in June, House Republicans introduced a bill to prevent federal agencies such as the Department of Energy from considering the social costs of carbon pollution when fashioning regulations. Elizabeth Kolbert, talking about using moments where people are distracted, deeply concerned about, for example, well, last week it was Texas. Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of the largest private oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, says he's planning to eliminate the department's special envoy for climate change.
Well, I think that what we have here is, and it's interestingly true in both Texas and Florida. Florida's government has also tried to really systematically suppress discussion of climate change in a state like Florida, which is probably the state in the country that's most vulnerable, certainly to the effects of sea level rise. And what we have right now, you could say, is an opportunity for citizens of those states to demand an honest conversation. And I actually saw news reports of the mayor of Miami, who's a Republican, had demanded that there be a conversation about climate change. So maybe people who are actually witnessing the effects will demand of their politicians that there be an honest conversation, because unfortunately, they've sort of let these guys just natter on and really, unfortunately, give us nonsense, and very dangerous nonsense, and as that's becoming increasingly clear.
We're going to break and come back to this conversation and talk as well to Colin Carlson. He's a lead author of a report on climate change-induced parasite extinction. We've been speaking with Elizabeth Kolbert, who writes for The New Yorker magazine. Her latest piece, Coming Storms. Stay with us.
Qué triste se oye la lluvia en los techos de cartón. Qué triste vive mi gente en las casas de cartón. Viene bajando el obrero, casi arrastrando sus pasos por el peso del sufrir. Mira que mucho a sufrir. Mira que pesa el sufrir. Arriba, deja la mujer preñada. Abajo está la ciudad y se pierde en su mar.
Cardboard houses here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the United States continues to deal with unprecedented floods and hurricanes, a new study has revealed climate change is also driving the mass extinction of parasites that are critical to natural ecosystems and could add to the planet's sixth great mass extinction event that's currently underway. The report in the journal Science Advances warns that about a third of all parasite species could go extinct by 2070 due to human activity. The loss of species of lice, fleas, and worms could have profound ripple effects on the environment and might pave the way for new parasites to colonize humans and other animals with disastrous health outcomes. For more, we're joined by Colin Carlson, lead author of a report published last week, which revealed climate change is driving the mass extinction of parasites that are critical to natural ecosystems. He's a PhD candidate in environmental science policy and management at the University of California, Berkeley. Still with us, Elizabeth Colbert, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for The New Yorker magazine. Her latest piece, Coming Storms. She reports extensively on climate change. So I wanted to start with Colin Carlson. Talk about what is happening to parasites in the world and why it matters.
Good morning. So I think the key thing that we need to get out there is that there's a lot of things about climate change we still don't know. We spent a lot of time in the last 15, 20 years focusing on the extinction of big charismatic wildlife, and we've thought a little bit about how that might impact their parasites. But the direct impacts of climate change on parasites haven't been as well studied. So our research comes out and sort of does this global survey and really thinks through, okay, how good or bad could climate change be for parasites? And it turns out that parasites follow the same logic most species do. A handful do a little bit better in a changing climate, and the vast majority actually do a lot worse. They lose a lot of habitat, they lose their hosts, they face very high extinction rates.
So talk about why parasites are important in the world.
So I think one of the really cool things about parasites is that we have undervalued them for decades. And that means that when it turns out they actually serve important roles in ecosystems, it's all the more surprising. Parasites are a huge part of what holds ecosystems together. They can be the majority of biomass in an ecosystem. They can be 80% of the links in a food web. They control wildlife populations. They keep populations down, just like predators do. And just like predators in the 18th and 19th century when we were eradicating them, parasites are obviously a hard sell. But it turns out they play this important regulatory role. And what we think could happen in a changing climate is with these very high extinction rates, the loss of that stabilizing role could produce opportunities for new patterns of wildlife and human disease that are genuinely concerning.
So you say that parasites are among the most threatened species on Earth. Now, I may be hard, Colin Carlson, in the world you're in as a scientist to understand how difficult it is for lay people to understand this, but assume no knowledge when it comes to parasites, why they're important. Most people would think, great, it's good to get rid of parasites.
So I think the important thing, right, is that, for one thing, the majority of parasites never affect humans. There are over 300,000 potentially species of parasitic worm on Earth, and of those, a handful, maybe up to 1,000 at most, affect humans. A very similar thing is true for wildlife parasites. We have this idea that parasites are probably not good most of the time, but most of what they're doing in ecosystems is just directly interacting with wildlife species. Most host-parasite relationships are stable. They're at some sort of equilibrium, just like most ecosystems are without environmental change. What we think is going to happen is the destabilization of those pairs of parasites and their hosts. And just like with, I think, most things in climate change research, the sort of overarching maxim is that change is bad. There's a massive predictive crisis. There's a lot of species we still don't know what the impacts will be. And so, on average, changing things from the way they are is probably actually not a good thing.
Can you give us some examples of common parasites?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of parasites in the news these days, right? I'm from Connecticut originally, and so Lyme disease is always in the news, and we always have deer ticks in the news because of it. And deer ticks are one of those rare species in our study that gains a lot of range. But there's also a lot of ticks on Earth that are threatened. There's a lot of worms on Earth that are threatened. To get back at this role that parasites play, I think one of the most incredible cases that we've found in our research is these horsehair worms in Japan. They change the behavior of crickets so that they jump into streams, and that ends up being the majority of the food that endangered Japanese trout eat. So even though parasites are manipulating host behavior, they're literally moving energy through an ecosystem and keeping actually endangered wildlife populations stable. And a lot of species like that are the ones in our study that are threatened with extinction.
Colin Carlson, I just wanted to ask about your very interesting background. Our audience might be surprised to know you were born in 1996. You're what, 31 now? You enrolled 21
Something
now.
like that.
21 now. 21 now. You enrolled at the University of Connecticut at the age of 12. By the time you were 16, you'd also obtained a bachelor's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology, and another in environmental studies, as well as a master's degree in the same subject. In 2011, Business Insider included you in a roundup titled 16 of the Smartest Children in History, alongside Mozart, Picasso, and the chess master Bobby Fischer. So you've been doing this for quite some time now, but you're only 21 years old.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the climate you find yourself in right now, so to speak. The climate going to the top of the country, to President Trump, who talks about climate change as a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. How does this affect your work and your colleagues' work, your friends?
So a few things on that. I grew up in a rural town in Connecticut where climate change was a very taboo topic, and when I go home, I think it still is. I think that's one of the things that has pushed me towards this kind of research. I think that in the context of not just the current administration, but the current challenge that we face in terms of communicating science to the public, it's incredibly important that we are transparent and honest about sort of the full impacts of climate change, the fact that, yeah, maybe 1 or 2 parasite extinctions might be good, the vast majority are bad. We have to give these balanced perspectives. I think that level of transparency is a huge part of how we continue to sell climate change research. More broadly, I would say that a lot of my colleagues, a lot of folks that I work with, a lot of the people who have collected data that are part of our study are very worried about the continued status of climate change research in the United States. A lot of our study relies on museum collections, and those are a huge foundation of biological research. We have to have museum collections to understand change over time. There's really no way we could have ever done our study without them. And I know a lot of folks are worried about museum collections and other biological collections being defunded in the coming years. We're already seeing some funding cuts for graduate research in ecology and evolutionary biology. Hopefully those won't translate into more funding cuts. But I think that in the coming years, it's absolutely critical that we continue to support those programs. We continue to fund research that makes the links between where we've been ecologically and where we're going. Yeah.
Explain, though, more why museum collections matter.
So our study is reconstructive in a lot of ways. It's the first to map out this many species of parasite at once. And the way that we do that is we look for records of where parasites have been to reconstruct their habitat. It's a very top-down approach. So the way that we end up doing that in practice is we take a set of museum specimens that have coordinates attached to them. It'll be an island in the Pacific, and we'll have the longitude and latitude, and that goes into a database that feeds our models. Our study is based in large part on the U.S. National Parasite Collection, which is currently housed at the Smithsonian. There's over 20 million specimens in that collection. We've mapped out 150,000 records for this study, and I would say those almost exclusively come in some form or another from either field research by biologists or from museum collections. We use collections in a lot of research this way. We use it to say, here's where species have been, here are the conditions that they've been found in, here's how we can inform our projections of the future based on those records. And so this is an absolutely indispensable role that collections play.
I wanted to bring Elizabeth Colbert back into the conversation, author of The Sixth Extinction. Can you put Colin Carlson's work, the significance of this report, in context and explain further The Sixth Extinction?
Well, the sixth extinction, we're referring to the idea that we're in a mass extinction event, so that there have been 5 what are called major mass extinctions over the course of the history of multicellular life. So over the last 500 million years or so, and the most famous of all these is the 5th. It's the event that did in the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, which was in all likelihood caused by an asteroid impact. So now the idea is that because of what we humans are doing to the planet, we have extremely elevated extinction rates, and we are either, by different people's definitions, we are in another potentially major mass extinction events. Now, one of the hallmarks of a mass extinction event is that you get extinctions across all different groups of animals. So from the very tiny to the very, very large. It's sort of an indiscriminate event, and takes out a lot of different groups at the same time. That is the very definition of a mass extinction event. So if you were in a mass extinction event, then if you would expect very elevated extinction rates, as I say, across virtually all groups, including our friends the parasites.
And what most interested you, Elizabeth Kolbert, about this Science Advances report, Colin Carlson's work?
Well, I think Colin makes a really, important point, which is that we are always, everyone's aware tigers are in terrible trouble, elephants are in terrible trouble, giraffes are in terrible trouble, and so we're almost always talking about, really charismatic animals and what's happening to them. But E.O. Wilson, makes the point, I'm not sure I'm quoting him directly, but it's the little things that run the world. It's really, very tiny invertebrates and microorganisms that make the world work and the way we know it. And so when you're messing around with that, when you're messing around with the very tiny world that we're not really paying a lot of attention to, you can get some really, really big impacts that you didn't anticipate, as I say, in part because you didn't even know what was going on.
We were talking about the political context that is taking place right now in Washington. President Trump has just nominated the Republican Oklahoma Congressman Jim Bridenstine to head NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Bridenstine has no science credentials, has repeatedly denied the human impact on climate change. NASA conducts a significant amount of global climate change research. In 2013, Congressman Bridenstine took to the House floor to demand President Obama apologize for funding climate change research.
Global temperatures stopped rising 10 years ago. Global temperature changes, when they exist, correlate with sun output and ocean cycles. Here's what we absolutely know. We know that Oklahoma will have tornadoes when the cold jet stream meets the warm Gulf air. And we also know that this president spends 30 times as much money on global warming research as he does on weather forecasting and warning. For this gross misallocation, the people of Oklahoma are ready to accept the president's apology, and I intend to submit legislation to fix this.
So that was Oklahoma Congressman Jim Bridenstine, who President Trump has now nominated to be head of NASA. I want to get both of your responses, beginning with Elizabeth Kolbert.
Well, unfortunately, he's a pretty characteristic nominee of this administration to positions that have, traditionally been held by very eminent scientists. And you're seeing this sort of wholesale undermining of scientific, inquiry at the top of the U.S. government, and you have to say to yourself, whom does that benefit? It does not benefit scientists, and it certainly doesn't benefit, the public. So there's obviously an agenda here, and it's pretty, as I said, it's a pretty scary one when you're having people at the very top of the U.S. government who are basically peddling patent medicine. It's really, really not a happy situation.
And Colin Carlson, as a scientist yourself, your response?
I think it's incredibly concerning to see science not only deprioritized, but actively worked against by the administration. The view from the ground is that a lot of researchers are incredibly worried about our ability to keep doing research that is scientifically ethical, that is valid, that presents issues like climate change objectively, and our ability to continue to be funded to do that research. I think this is one in a set of decisions by this administration that really do give us reason to be worried. That said, I think there is some silver lining in that I know that this has brought out a lot of passion among scientists who I work with and scientists across the country. I think this is giving us a chance to really shine as a community. And I think that this might, in some inadvertent ways, lead to a really productive, 4 years of research.
And Colin Carlson, in your report on parasite biodiversity facing extinction and redistribution in a changing climate, what most surprised you?
I think one of the really cool results buried a little bit in the study is that with the kind of models that we use, human parasites or parasites that spread human diseases, like that deer tick, don't actually have any inherently better or worse chance in a changing climate. It's kind of a lottery. And we've known this about climate change and extinctions for a while. We know that there are factors that make some species do better or worse. There's variation between groups. But really, for parasitic species, because they're dependent on wildlife and because wildlife are already threatened at such a high rate, what we think is going to happen is a pretty high across-the-board extinction rate, like Elizabeth was talking about, regardless of whether that affects humans or wildlife. I think the rates that we are predicting are shockingly high, and it's definitely a lot more than we expected going in.
I want to thank you both for joining us. Of course, we'll continue to discuss this issue, the issue of the intensity and frequency of hurricanes and climate change. Colin Carlson, co-author of the piece, Parasite Biodiversity Faces Extinction and Redistribution in a Changing Climate. Elizabeth Kolbert, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Sixth Extinction, her latest piece in the New Yorker magazine, Hurricane Harvey and the Storms to Come. Thanks so much for being with us. When we come back from break, we'll go to Florida to talk with the prize-winning author Edwidge Danticat, Haitian-American writer who also had to take cover, had to evacuate. And we're going to talk about hear from voices of survivors of the Mexico earthquake and speak with Kim Ives about what took place in Haiti when Hurricane Irma struck. Stay with us.
Dijo que balas del hermoso, viendo al África llorar, en el imperio mañoso, nunca se debe confiar. Nunca se debe confiar. Y dijo el Che legendario, como sembrando una flor, al buen revolucionario solo lo mueve el amor. Solo lo mueve el amor.
The Cuban singer Sylvia Rodriguez singing live at Central Park's Summer Stage last night. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 4 people have died and nearly 6 million people are without power in Florida after Hurricane Irma made landfall Sunday on the Florida Keys as a Category 4 hurricane. The storm also flooded the streets of downtown Miami, turning Miami's main strip, Brickell Avenue, into a 3-foot-high raging river. The storm sparked one of the largest mass evacuations in U.S. history, with nearly 7 million people ordered to leave their homes. We go now to speak with one of them. We go to Florida to speak with the award-winning Haitian-American writer Edwidge Danticat. She lives in Miami but had to evacuate to Orlando. Edwidge, how are you? Where are you now? And your thoughts on what's taking place in your state?
Good morning, Amy. Thank you for checking in. I am fine. I'm doing much better than a lot of other Floridians. We had to evacuate on Thursday because the area that I live is not too far from downtown Miami, and it's close to a bay, and so we're part of an extended evacuation area. So we decided, actually 2 hours notice on Thursday, to drive up to Orlando, where we have friends, and the road was really, I'd never seen anything like that. We were driving about 10 miles an hour most of the way because of, we're among some of the 6 million or so people who were told to evacuate. So it was a very long drive with a lot of folks also leaving. And we got to Orlando hoping for a weaker version of the storm. Gas was there was a lot of shortage of gas. So we couldn't clear the state totally. So we stayed in Orlando with some friends, where the storm did come last night in a weaker version. There was a lot of wind, and I'm not sure what the damage is out there now because we haven't been able to go out. We don't have any power where I am, as something like 3 million Floridians don't have power. But we're okay, and we're happy for that, and are ready to return and see what happened, what we can do to help.
I wanted to ask you about an issue that also plagued people as Hurricane Harvey was hitting Texas, where in Houston, something like 85,000 young people have DACA status, are allowed to stay, live, and work in this country. And in the midst of the horror of that hurricane, President Trump pulls DACA. I wanted to ask you about temporary protected status for more than 50,000 Haitians. Their status set to expire in July. But after pressure from immigrant rights activists, the Trump administration extended the temporary protected status for 6 months, meaning they could again face the threat of deportation in January. Are you hearing concern about this as people are fleeing, as millions were forced to evacuate? Edwidge? We may have just lost Edwidge Danticat, who is speaking to us from Orlando. She actually lives in Miami, but she is one of the 7 million evacuees in Florida. But we are also joined in studio by Kim Ives. And it's really important to talk not only what's happened in the United States, but Hurricane Irma was the largest it was the largest ever in the Atlantic. The death toll from Hurricane Irma has reached at least 27 in the Caribbean. The numbers expected to rise as rescuers reach the hardest-hit areas. Irma destroyed major parts of several Caribbean islands, including Barbuda and St. Martin. Cuba also suffered major flooding in Havana and other cities, but there were no reported deaths. The entrepreneur Richard Branson of Virgin Airlines, among other things, has called for a disaster recovery Marshall Plan for the Caribbean. Cuba's already sent more than 750 doctors and other health workers to Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Lucia, the Bahamas, Dominica, and Haiti. While Haiti avoided a direct hit from Irma, the hurricane still caused substantial damage in a country still recovering from the 2010 earthquake, as well as Hurricane Matthew last year. Irma displaced more than 100,000 Haitians and destroyed crops in the north of the country. So Kim Ives joins Edwidge Danticat to talk not only about what's happened in Florida, but what's happened on the island of Haiti. Kim, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks, Amy. To the TPS question, you have about close to 60,000 Haitians who are facing deportation in January. This is really a triple whammy because most of Haiti's foreign exchange comes from remittances from people working in the U.S., so that's going to be cut off. They're going to go into a country which is debilitated, not only since the earthquake, but since Hurricane Matthew. And thirdly, a lot of their homes were damaged in the flooding and the winds that hit southern Florida. So it's a terrible situation for the Haitians in Florida. But for Haiti, it was also bad because you have to take 11 months ago, October 4th, 2016, the country, the southern peninsula, was hit by a Category 4 hurricane. That was Matthew, and that destroyed 80% of the country's, 85% of the grains, corn, rice, sorghum, peas, millet, comes out of that southern peninsula. That was wiped out, and 40% of the fruit comes out of that part of the country. And so it was the north that was picking up the slack, if you will. And that area has now been hit by Irma. Also, we should say that the South had a 3-year drought before the hurricane, so there's this sort of climactic whiplash that's happening. You go from drought to these floods. The new climate is so volatile, it's really hurting a country like Haiti, which in the past 6 years has gone from the 7th to the 3rd most climate vulnerable country.
And so, while Haiti did not get a direct hit because of its devastation, it is impacted in a way most people are not talking about. They're just saying, oh, it was a mess for Haiti.
Right, exactly. But it's a glancing blow, which was still devastating for farmers in the north. People had their crops wiped out by flooding and by wind. And it's been just a terrible blow to a country which is already food insecure.
Can you talk about the massive outbreak of cholera since the earthquake and how that fits in here with what's happening now?
Well, that's the huge dilemma, is that cholera was brought to the country by the United Nations occupation troops, which have occupied the country for the past 13 years. They came in after the 2004 coup d'etat, and we're supposed to be there for 6 months. Now, 13 years later, they're supposedly winding down to leave on October 15th. This is not the case. In fact, they're just replacing soldiers with policemen and women. And so you have a cholera epidemic, the worst in the world, brought by Nepalese peacekeepers back in October 2010, 7 years ago. And cholera, for those who don't know, is a waterborne disease. It's basically when sewage gets in your drinking water. So when you have this massive flooding, you're definitely going to see a huge spike in cholera cases in Haiti.
And just to update us in the cholera case, when you talk about peacekeepers, you're talking about UN peacekeepers.
Yeah, quote-unquote peacekeepers.
And the latest on the responsibility the UN has taken for this massive outbreak. How many people died?
It's about 1 million have been affected. Maybe 100,000 have died. Those figures may be conservative because a lot of people are not registered who do die. Yeah, the cholera epidemic, the UN has taken no responsibility, essentially. They finally admitted last year that their response was not great, but Ban Ki-moon, when he was going out, made a sort of half apology. But they have not given any reparations to Haiti. And, this has been taken to the courts here in New York City, but the courts keep saying the UN has immunity.
I want to go right now to the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
Let me at the start directly address the Haitian people. The United Nations deeply regrets the loss of life and suffering caused by the cholera outbreak in Haiti. On behalf of the United Nations, I want to say very clearly we apologize to the Haitian people. We simply did not do enough with regard to the cholera outbreak and its spread in Haiti. We are profoundly sorry for our role.
We are profoundly sorry for our role, said Ban Ki-moon as he was leaving as UN Secretary General. As we wrap up, the significance of what he said and what he didn't say, Kim.
But stopping short of saying that it was UN troops that brought the cholera into Haiti. So they've avoided this because legally they'll be liable. But it's been brought by the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, brought a suit which has been rebuffed in the UN claim system and also rebuffed in the United States courts here.
And before we go, I was asking Edwidge Danticat before we lost her. I mean, power's out to half the people of Florida, so it's very difficult even to get that phone call. But the issue of TPS and Haitians both dealing with this terrible hurricane and having to leave. You have 10 seconds.
As I say, they're
50,000.
Yeah, they're going back. It's close to 60,000 who will be sent back. And again, it's a triple whammy. They lose the remittances, they lose their homes, and now they're going to be sent back to Haiti, which is suffering food insecurity.
Unless President Trump changes his mind.
Unless he changes his mind.
Kim Ives, I want to thank you for being with us, editor at Haiti Liberté. And finally, we end in Mexico. The death toll from Thursday's devastating 8.2 magnitude earthquake has risen to 90 as rescue teams continue to search through the rubble in parts of the southern states of Oaxaca and Chiapas. Over the weekend, journalist Angelusia Noel spoke to survivors from the earthquake in Oaxaca, in Juchitán, the city hardest hit by the earthquake.
My name is Maria Teresa Garcia Morales, and this is where my mother lived. My mother died the day of the earthquake while rescuing my niece and my sister. We are here in Asuncion, Ixtaltepec, Oaxaca. It is a town where we are lacking many things, and the children are lacking them too. We don't have water. Please, people, those in the city help us more than ever. One has to have solidarity with our people and help us because we don't have anywhere to live. We don't have anywhere to stay. We are staying in the streets, in the open air, and sometimes it rains, and we have to see where we can stay.
José Juan Robledo Castillo.
This is where my bed was. Here was the bed, and I ran outside and successfully grabbed my daughters. It was this tree trunk that fell on top of our bed. I had to move the trunk to drag the bed out and use here in the backyard because that is where we are staying. We have to stay in the backyard because we are still at risk that the house will fall down, and the government help and help from the municipal government has still not arrived. They came to visit us here on the street corner, but up until now, we haven't had any help from the government of the municipality of Juchitán.
Yeah, my name is Kaya Regalado. It's the only one time that we received something for help. Not other kind of people, especially governments, municipal or the federal government, they didn't bring us anything because we don't have water. And of course, we don't have electricity. We don't have electricity. So, for example, in this moment, when it's at night, we feel really scared because, you know, the earthquake, the movement, we feel really scared because we don't have light. So it's that kind of, and of course we need something that, kind of food that we can eat for these days. So.
Voices from Juchitán, Oaxaca, which was the city hardest hit by last week's earthquake off the coast of Mexico. And that does it for today's broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, Amel Ahmed, and Nat Needham. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, and Carl Marxer. And to our camera crew, John Randolph, Kieran Meadows, Anna Ozbek, and Matt Ely. If you want to see our hurricane and climate change coverage, go to democracynow.org, read the transcripts, the video and audio podcasts, and pass them around. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.